The Emmett Fox reading is titled The Kindling of God, and it's referring to Psalm 18. In verse 28, the psalmist moves to another phase of the teaching. Thou wilt light my lamp. The Lord my God will enlighten my darkness. Many similes have been offered by religious teachers to illustrate the relationship between God and man. One of the best known and most helpful is to think of man as a spark from a great fire, which is God. The spark is not the whole of the fire, but it is part of it, and therefore the same nature, and possesses potentially all the characteristics of the parent fire. It can ignite many things upon which it falls, thus producing another fire essentially of the same nature as the original fire. The kindling of God.
Okay, so today I'm going to talk sort of a confluence of ideas, liminal spaces and Lazarus from a metaphysical point of view and how they intersect. So let's start with what is liminal space and what does it have to do with us? I came across actually an introduction to the publication Oneing by Father Richard Rohr, and I've mentioned him to you before because he while he is a Franciscan Catholic, his religious explorations are very much on what we might call the fringe of it. His most recent book promotes the concept of the cosmic Christ, for instance, the Christ who has come to visit this world, this earth, in many different shapes, many different forms over time to reach all people. So I'm going to read a fairly lengthy excerpt from what he said, and then we'll go from there. He writes, America is a ritually starved culture, at least when it comes to meaningful rituals beyond blowing out the candles on a birthday cake. True rituals, as opposed to mere repetition of civic ceremonies, intentionally create what anthropologists call liminality, or a liminal space. The term liminal comes from the Latin word lumen, meaning threshold. He then says, we all need to consciously spend time at the thresholds of our lives, and we need wise elders to create and hold such spaces for us. And I'm going to sort of step outside for a minute to remind those of you who've been with us longer than the pandemic, that for quite some time, we had Karen Heaster with us who would lead us through rituals once or twice a year, where she would create, without the name, a liminal space where we celebrated. And we still do occasionally do a ritual, even without her guidance, celebrating the gifts that our ancestors have brought to each of us. So I'm going to go back to this statement because I think it's so important. We all need to consciously spend time at the thresholds of our lives, and we need wise elders to create and hold such spaces for us. Liminality is a form of holding the tension between one space and another. It is these transitional moments of our lives that authentic transformation can happen. Otherwise, it's just business as usual and an externally boring status quo existence. In liminal space, we must leave business as usual, business which often looks like a sleepwalking trance through daily life. And we must voluntarily enter a world where rules and explanations are quite different. Some call it voluntary displacement. When we wake up in this way and find ourselves on the threshold of something new, we are shocked into realizing that our usual trance state is not the only option, and there might just be something more. Historic initiation rites were always inherently religious, but not in the organized way that so many of us have come to resent in religion now. And To that, I'll refer the concept of weddings. For so many of the people that I officiate, for instance, they're just getting the job done because that's the only way you can be legal. Very few do I encounter who understand that properly done, a wedding creates a bonding between two people that is outside the ordinary, a bonding between two people, and ideally the divine or the higher power that they represent, and those who have come to share with them this wonderful moment. For many of them, I've actually had said, oh, we just wanted to have a party, so we figured we'd get married. Or we really don't care about the ceremony, we just need to get married. And think about other experiences you've had with rituals. In so many Christian churches, there's the ritual of communion, for instance. And the question is, does my experience with communion put me on a threshold to a new understanding? Or is it just something we do? He goes on to say, over the decades, I've seen the need for liminal spaces again and again. Without some sort of guidance and reframing, we don't understand the necessary ebb and flow of life, the ascents and the descents, the need to embrace our tears and our letting go, as well of our successes and our triumphs. Without standing on the threshold for much longer than we're comfortable, we won't be able to see beyond ourselves to the broader and more inclusive world that lives before us. Revelation 3:20 tells us that Christ stands at the door and knocks. Too many of us want to show up at the doorway looking prim and proper and perfect. We stuff our egos and our anxieties in the front hall closet so Christ won't see them when we open the door. And by the way, I just saw a result. A recent study says half of the population lives fairly consistently with worry and anxiety. But Christ isn't showing up to see our perfect selves. Instead, we are invited into a deep, real, transformative conversation there on the threshold between who we are and who we can become, if we're willing to let go of what holds us back. If we are able to stand it and stand there, liminality is likely to induce an inner crisis. And this is Father Rohr, I'm well known for saying that the two greatest liminal spaces in human life are great love and great suffering. He goes on to say, my mother's and father's deaths were powerful liminal spaces that lasted most of a year. More recently, the death of Venus, my beloved dog, brought me nearer to God on the liminal threshold. In her final moments, Venus taught me about love and acceptance of the unknown at levels I never could have imagined. Religious leaders throughout Christian history have taught us that time spent apart in a hermitage or other retreat setting will help with stripping us and bringing us into a liminal space. Only when we cross the threshold can we see in a larger frame. Only after spending time in liminal space can we live as Jesus taught, being in the world but not of it. Unfortunately, many people come on retreat just to receive reinforcement for what they already know, or I'll say what they already think they know. I see them sitting there, arms crossed, protecting themselves from anything that might challenge their well-barricaded status quo. Without some humility, vulnerability, and openness, there's really no reason to take a retreat at all. If we aren't honest about our reasons for coming and our openness to transformation, we should just stay home. Liminal space doesn't have to be difficult. It can be challenging. It can also be extremely rewarding. Imagine immersing yourself in another culture or country. I'm not talking about making a visit, but of really engaging with the culture, eating their food, talking with the people, living life through their daily rhythms. When we do this, our understanding of existence expands. we comprehend that our way of viewing the world is not the only perspective. Other tastes, sounds, and smells assail our senses. Other viewpoints, other priorities are revealed to us, as every view is a view from a specific point, usually unrecognized. And another side here, I arranged for one of our other ministers in marriagechaplain.com to do a wedding, officiate a wedding for 2 Hindus. I chose him because I knew he had spent a great deal of time in India studying Buddhism and Hinduism. He wrote me back afterward saying that because of his familiarity, he was able to modify and add to the ceremony so it reflected the belief patterns, the understandings that the couple had been brought up in when they lived in India. So he had that broadened perspective. When we broaden our perspective, our understanding of others, of other pieces, our understanding of existence expands. So liminal space relativizes our perspective. When we embrace liminality, we choose hope over sleepwalking, over denial, and over despair. The world around us becomes an enchanted universe, something we intuitively understood when we were young and somehow lost touch with as we grew older. And I'll remind you that in previous conversations, we've talked about the fact how often very young children seem to have memories or understandings of places, of situations very different from where they are now. And then they lose the ability to see from the other side, to hear from the other side as they grow older, just as no doubt each of us did. And then for each of us, it's taken experiences of liminality to begin to be able to hear, to see, to know something other than this particular existence. And that's part of our journey. So, having talked about liminal, where does Lazarus come into this? Well, from the Metaphysical Dictionary, put out by Unity, that one of the definitions of Lazarus is whom the God helps. And there are other definitions, but they all sort of center around that. And going on, the writer says, it refers to the part of the consciousness that is helped by the good, though apparently utterly neglected by the person themselves. So there's 2 Lazaruses that have key appearance in the Christian Bible. There's the beggar versus the rich man showing how easy it is to lose ourselves in everyday earth senses. And when we do that, we are likely to start to devitalize our true spiritual aspects of ourselves, or spiritual attributes of ourselves. To quote the Bible, the higher soul life is put out of the consciousness and fed with the dogs. Then fast forward to the New Testament and Jesus' friend Lazarus. We can call it a liminal experience when God's higher self intervenes to offer a new life, a renewed life. And this story shows us no matter how far we've strayed from pure spiritual connection, spiritual power, as here exemplified by Jesus the Christ, can intervene and it can roll away the stone of earth consciousness, which is holding us to our earth bonds, to our despair, to our spiritual separation from God. So the other Lazarus has had the liminal experience, if you will, of departing from the physical flesh and experiencing the death of it, and then being brought back to it, but we trust with a new appreciation. Think of those whom you've met who have been dead and come back. I can't speak for all of them, but the ones I've come to know pretty universally, a major change of understanding of themselves, of the world. I knew a fellow named Alan Ramsey. I doubt that any of you did. He's been dead some time. But before his spiritual awakening, he was just this guy, to quote the Hitchhiker's Guide. And then he died. And as he was dead, he found himself floating over his body, watching the paramedics frantically trying to revive him. And the story he told was he had the realization then, oh, this where I am, this is reality. Down there is the movie. That was an experience that came from being held on the threshold in the liminal space. If you look back at your lives, the chances are you have had one or multiple experiences where you were brought to a threshold between two understandings, the earth and the other, where you could gain new comprehension, where you could see more than you ever saw before. And didn't that change your lives? And if it hasn't happened yet, place an order with the divine that you're ready to have your understandings, your being challenged so that you can understand the new, the wonderful, the beyond, much of which is something we can't express. We will be unable to share with others because it's not of words, not of intellectual comprehension. In the Sikh faith, one of the sayings is, if you want to practice love, come to me with your head in your hands. That's what liminal space is about. Giving you experience while your head is in your hands. So even when you put your head back on, you're not going to be able to fully share it outside of your own spirit, your own soul. Going back to the Metaphysical Dictionary, I've updated the pronouns here because the dictionary was written many years ago. But it says, they who want the inner life to spring forth must believe in the reality of spiritual powers, and they must exercise their faith by invoking in prayer the presence of the invisible but omnipresent God. This reveals to consciousness the glory of spirit, and the soul has witness in itself of a power that it knew not. Hold that as a vision for yourself. I'm going to say that again. Those who want the inner life to spring forth must believe in the reality of spiritual powers and must exercise their faith by invoking in prayer the presence of the invisible but in the omnipresent God. This reveals to consciousness the glory of spirit and of the soul, and the soul has witness in itself of a power that it knew not. So think Lazarus. Think of yourself as Lazarus. Not that we want you to physically die, but that you welcome the challenge of being on the threshold between the earth and the reality, so you can comprehend, grok, understand, see something that is beyond what you have never experienced before, the power that it knew not. And I came across a poem that I think is a fitting close as part of thinking toward moving into liminalness and transcendent experiences for ourselves in our spiritual walk. The poem goes, and there's no title. No fear of the future, no cloud over the present, no shadow of the past. a daily disposition from which we welcome with faithful abandon all the God-ordained circumstances of our lives. I wonder whether, if when you find yourself in that state of anxiety, worry, it might not be worthwhile to request of the divine to be provided a liminal space to reflect on the experience and also remind each of us that there's so much more to help us put to quote Sister Pepper, the trifugalities of this here and now, hold it in perspective during our walk on this planet.